Sit by the hearth, pull your chair a little closer to the warmth, and let the flickering flames be your only guide. Outside, the fog of old London clings to the window panes like a shroud, heavy with the scent of coal, damp stone, and ancient secrets. We are about to embark on a journey through the labyrinth of the 19th century, a time of grand empires and velvet curtains, but also of shadows that moved within the medicine cabinets and hospital wards. Before we descend into the gaslit mysteries of the Victorian night, I invite you to settle in. If you find solace in these chronicles, perhaps you might share your thoughts with us. Leave a mark of your presence with a like, or tell a friend about our gathering by the fire. Your company is what keeps these lanterns burning. Do you ever find yourself frustrated by a 2-hour wait in a modern clinic, surrounded by white walls, sterile air, and the comforting beep of digital monitors? In the year 1850, your greatest stroke of luck would have been never reaching a doctor at all. You see, Victorian medicine was rarely about the art of healing. It was a grim calculation of how much agony a human soul could endure before the light went out. It was an era of paradoxes, where a gentleman might discuss the latest scientific breakthroughs in a mahogany-paneled library, while just a few streets away, a surgeon was sharpening a saw that had never seen a drop of soap. We often look back at this era through a romantic lens, seeing only the lace and the progress. But tonight, we are going to look at the blood under the fingernails of the men who called themselves healers. To understand the Victorian hospital, you must first forget everything you know about cleanliness. In our world, the sight of a single drop of blood on a doctor's clothing would be a cause for scandal, an immediate breach of protocol, and a trigger for rigorous quarantine. But in the bustling, overcrowded wards of the mid-1800s, the visual landscape was painted in much darker hues. Imagine walking into a dimly lit operating theater, the air thick with a cloying, heavy stench, a mixture of unwashed bodies, the metallic tang of blood, and the sweet, sickly smell of rotting flesh that the doctors called laudable pus. There stands the surgeon, the hero of the hour, illuminated by a dusty skylight or a few guttering candles. He does not wear a white coat of purity. Instead, he wears an apron that has not been laundered in months, perhaps even years. It is a garment of nightmare, stiff and heavy, crusted with a dark, brownish-black patina. This crust was a literal accumulation of every patient he had ever touched. Every spurt of arterial blood, every discharge of an abscess, every fluid that the human body can surrender in its final moments of distress was preserved on that fabric. To the Victorian mind, this was not a biohazard. It was a badge of honor. A clean apron was the sign of a novice, a man who hadn't yet seen the war of the wards. The more encrusted, the more foul-smelling, and the more blood-soaked the apron, the more experienced and respected the surgeon was perceived to be. It was a tangible record of his career, a tapestry of past failures and hard-won lessons, worn proudly like a general's medals on a battlefield. When he walked down the street, the scent of his profession preceded him, a walking omen of the knife and the saw. These men, these pillars of the community, would often begin their mornings in the dead house, the morgue. They would be shoulder-deep in a cold, gray corpse, slicing through muscle and bone to study the cause of a mysterious death or to demonstrate anatomy to a group of eager students. Their hands would be covered in the fluids of the deceased, the very essence of decay. And then, as the hospital bells rang for the next appointment, they would wipe their hands, not with soap and water, but perhaps on their already filthy apron or a shared, damp rag, and move straight to the maternity ward. Think of the expectant mother, lying in a bed shared with 2 other women, waiting for the doctor's healing touch. She did not know that the hands reaching out to her were still carrying the invisible, lethal particles of the morgue. They would perform internal examinations with the same fingers that had just been exploring a gangrenous limb. They did not understand that they were the primary vehicles of a silent, invisible executioner. The concept of bacteria was a ghost story they hadn't yet learned to believe in. They were men of science who believed in the miasma, the idea that bad air and foul smells were what carried disease. They would open the windows to let out the smell, never realizing that the most lethal thing in the room was not the air, but the stained, jagged fingernails of the man holding the scalpel. The instruments themselves were part of this macabre tradition. A surgeon's kit was a beautiful, terrifying collection of silver and ivory, kept in velvet-lined boxes. But between patients, these tools were rarely cleaned. A knife used to drain a septic wound was simply wiped on a sleeve before being used to lance a boil on the next person in line. The silk thread used for stitches was often carried in the surgeon's pocket or held between his teeth during the operation to keep it handy. Every stitch was an invitation for infection, every incision a doorway for death. In this era, a successful surgery was one where the patient survived the initial trauma of the blade, but the true battle began in the days that followed. The surgeons would watch for the appearance of pus, believing it was a sign of healing, unaware that they were witnessing the slow, agonizing onset of sepsis. They were bleeding a dying population in the name of restoration, essentially killing the patient's ability to fight the infection they themselves had introduced. It was a world where the physician's touch was often the final blow, a cold hand reaching out from a dark, unwashed past to extinguish the last flickering embers of a life. And as the screams of the operating theater faded into the low moans of the recovery ward, the survivors would have to face the next stage of Victorian medical care, the pharmacy. Stay where you are, for the fire is still warm, though the air in our story is about to grow colder, heavy with a sweetness that hides a jagged edge. We have spoken of the surgeon's bloodied hands, but now we must enter the Victorian home, specifically the nursery, where the gaslight casts long, dancing shadows on the cradle. In this age of industry, the ultimate commodity was peace, not the peace of a rested mind, but the terrifying silence of a drugged city. If you have ever felt the exhaustion of a long day, perhaps you reached for a simple herbal tea or a mild tablet to ease your mind. But in the 1800s, the boundary between medicine and narcotics was a line drawn in shifting sand. The Victorian pharmacy was a palace of glass, rows upon rows of exquisite cobalt blue and amber bottles, each promising to cure the incurable. But within those bottles lay the very essence of the poppy and the coca leaf. This was an era where the most dangerous substances on earth were sold over the counter as casually as a loaf of bread, often marketed to the most vulnerable members of society, the children of the poor. Imagine a weary mother in a damp, one-room tenement in London's East End. She works 16 hours a day in a match factory, her fingers stained yellow by phosphorus, her bones aching with a fatigue you and I will never truly know. Beside her, her infant cries, a thin, piercing sound of hunger and neglect. She cannot stop working, for if the matches aren't finished, there is no bread. In her desperation, she reaches for a bottle that she bought for a few pennies at the corner chemist. The label is comforting, featuring the kindly face of a grandmotherly figure. It is called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. The advertisement promised that it would soothe any human or animal, claiming it was perfectly harmless for even the most delicate babe. But as she tilts the bottle to the child's lips, she is not feeding them medicine. She is administering a lethal cocktail of alcohol and pure, unrefined morphine. Within minutes, the crying stops. The child's limbs go limp, their eyes roll back, and they sink into a profound, unnatural lethargy. To the mother, this looks like a miracle. It is the only way she can keep her job and keep her sanity. But this peace came at a staggering price. The child wasn't just sleeping. They were drifting in an opium-induced haze so deep that their tiny hearts began to forget how to beat. Thousands upon thousands of Victorian children were quieted into their graves. They called it the baby killer, but the law was slow to catch up to the prophet. The children who survived often grew up with stunted minds and bodies, their development arrested by the very syrup meant to aid them. It was a cycle of addiction that began in the cradle, creating generations of spiritless workers who were easier to manage because they were perpetually sedated. But the darkness of the pharmacy did not end with the children. For the Victorian adult, life was a grinding gears of labor and rigid social expectations, and the escape was found in the gilded elixir, known as laudanum. This was a mixture of opium and high-proof alcohol, and it was the Victorian equivalent of a daily coffee, only far more sinister. It was cheaper than gin and more socially acceptable than beer. A lady of high standing could take her drops to settle her nerves before a ball, while a poet would drink it to find the visions he needed for his next masterpiece. Think of the modern world's struggle with substances, the clinics and the warnings. Now imagine a world where heroin was sold as a non-addictive cough suppressant by Bayer, and cocaine was the secret ingredient in your morning tonic to give you vigor. They believed these drugs were gifts of progress, unaware that they were creating a nation of ghosts. People wandered the fog-cloaked streets in a waking dream, their pupils dilated, their minds fractured. The very remedies they took for a simple toothache or a bout of melancholy were slowly turning their blood into a toxic sludge of addiction. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a cabinet of shadows, a place where the cure was a slow-motion execution. They were a society that sought refuge from the harshness of the Industrial Revolution by retreating into a chemical fog, never realizing that the lantern they followed was leading them straight to the precipice. As we watch the mother in our story blow out the candle and lay her silent child in the cradle, we must wonder, how many of the tranquil scenes in Victorian literature were actually scenes of profound, unregulated intoxication? Before we move on to the sheer, visceral terror of the Victorian operating table, a place where the knife moved faster than the eye could follow, I must ask you to stay with us. The shadows are growing longer, and the true test of your resilience is yet to come. What we are about to uncover in the theater of blood will challenge everything you think you know about courage. Do not leave the warmth of the fire just yet, for the Victorian night has many more secrets to whisper, and the most harrowing of them are still waiting in the dark. The fire is dying down, and the shadows in the room are stretching their thin, dark fingers toward us. We have survived the unwashed hands of the surgeon and the silent, narcotic sleep of the nursery. But now we must step into the most harrowing arena of the 19th century, the surgical theater. In our modern world, surgery is a hushed affair of anesthesia, precision lasers, and deep, dreamless sleep. But in the year 1840, an operation was not a clinical procedure. It was a public spectacle of raw, unadulterated terror. It was a race against the very limits of human endurance, and the man holding the starter's pistol was often a giant named Robert Liston. Imagine a large circular room, tiered with benches like a Roman Colosseum. The air is stagnant, heavy with the copper tang of blood, and the scent of sawdust spread on the floor to soak up the inevitable deluge. On the benches sit medical students, curious gentlemen, and even the occasional thrill-seeker, all leaning forward to witness the master at work. In the center of the pit stands a wooden table, stained dark by decades of use, and strapped to it is a human being. This patient is wide awake. They have perhaps been given a stiff glass of brandy or a leather strap to bite on, but their eyes are wide, reflecting the glint of the sunlight through the dusty skylight. They can hear the murmur of the crowd and, more terrifyingly, the clatter of the surgeon's instruments as they are laid out on a side table. Then, the doors burst open. Robert Liston enters. He was a man of immense physical strength and a booming voice, famous for his arrogance as much as his skill. He would throw off his coat, roll up his sleeves, and address the crowd with his legendary catchphrase, "Time me, gentlemen, time me." He would then pull a long, gleaming knife from his belt, a blade he often kept between his teeth when he needed his hands free, and the nightmare would begin. You see, before the reliable use of ether or chloroform, the only mercy a surgeon could offer was speed. If an operation took more than a few minutes, the patient would almost certainly die from the sheer physiological shock of the pain. The heart would simply stop, unable to process the agony of the nerves being severed. Therefore, the greatest surgeons were the ones who could work with the frantic, blur-like speed of a magician. Liston was the fastest of them all. He could amputate a human leg at the thigh in less than 30 seconds. Think about that for a moment. In the time it takes you to pour a cup of tea, a man could have his flesh sliced, his bones sawn through, and his limb tossed into a bucket of sawdust. But speed, as spectacular as it was for the audience, was a double-edged sword. In the red haze of a lightning-fast surgery, precision was the first casualty. The surgical theater was a place of frantic motion, slippery floors, and blinding panic. There is a story, a dark legend that still haunts the halls of University College Hospital, about Liston's most infamous day, the operation with a 300% mortality rate. Liston was performing a routine leg amputation in front of a packed house. As the crowd held their breath and the stopwatches clicked, he moved with a speed that was almost supernatural. The knife flashed, the saw screamed through the bone, and the leg was off in record time. But in his violent haste, Liston did not just cut through the patient's thigh. His knife, moving with the momentum of a runaway train, sliced through the fingers of his own assistant, who was holding the leg steady. As Liston swung the bloody blade back to reach for a fresh dressing, the tip of the knife caught the coattails of a distinguished elderly spectator. The spectator, feeling the tug and seeing the blood-drenched blade so close to his vitals, was convinced he had been disemboweled. He collapsed onto the sawdust and died on the spot from a massive heart attack triggered by pure, unmitigated fright. In the days that followed, the horror only deepened. Both the patient and the assistant, whose fingers had been severed by the unwashed knife, developed the dreaded hospital gangrene. They died in agonizing fever, their bodies rotting while they were still alive. One surgery, one man on the table, 3 corpses in the morgue. It is a story that illustrates the brutal reality of Victorian progress. They were reaching for greatness, for the ability to repair the human frame, but they were doing so with the tools of a butcher and the mindset of an executioner. The patient's screams were not just a byproduct of the surgery, they were the soundtrack of the era. The surgeons would talk over the cries, explaining their techniques to the students while the person on the table begged for death or for a god that seemed to have forgotten the surgical theater. As the years rolled on, the introduction of anesthesia would eventually quiet these rooms, but even that was met with resistance. Some doctors believed that pain was a necessary stimulant that kept the body alive during surgery. They feared that a sleeping patient was too close to death. It was a world that valued the spectacle of the struggle over the comfort of the soul. Think of the courage it took to simply exist in a world where a broken bone or a deep wound could lead you to Liston's table. Think of the silence that must have fallen over London at night, a city filled with people carrying the physical and mental scars of these lightning surgeries. We often think of the Victorians as repressed or stiff, but perhaps they were simply a people who had seen too much, who lived every day with the knowledge that their lives could be ended in 30 seconds by a man who didn't think to wash his hands. But as we leave the blood-soaked sawdust of the theater behind, we find that the Victorian hunger for parts did not end with the living. To maintain the illusion of health and beauty in a world of decay, they turned their eyes toward the battlefields and the graveyards, seeking to harvest from the dead what they could no longer grow in themselves. The secrets of the Victorian smile are far more grisly than the surgery itself. And as we move into the next chapter of our chronicle, I must ask you to subscribe to our gathering here by the fire. By joining our circle, you ensure that these lost voices are never truly forgotten, and that the lanterns of history continue to cast their light into the darkest corners of our shared past. Stay close, for we are about to uncover the secret of Waterloo teeth and the macabre industry of the Victorian dental chair. The fire has burned down to embers now, and the air in our sanctuary feels thin, as if the shadows themselves are breathing. We have witnessed the speed of the surgeon's blade and the narcotic haze of the nursery, but now we must confront a different kind of horror, one that was hidden behind the most charming of smiles. In our modern world, we obsess over the perfect smile, spending fortunes on porcelain veneers and laser whitening. But in the mid-19th century, a beautiful set of teeth was not a product of hygiene. It was often a harvest from the dead. To look upon a Victorian lady of high standing was to see an image of carefully constructed perfection. Her skin was a mask of white lead, her waist was cinched by whalebone, and when she smiled, she revealed a row of straight, ivory-white teeth. But if you could have peered beneath the surface of that smile, you would have found a grisly secret. The Victorian diet was a disaster for dental health. The industrialization of sugar meant that for the first time in history, sweetness was cheap and ubiquitous. From the richest lord to the poorest clerk, London was a city of rotting gums and blackened stumps. In an age before the toothbrush was a household staple, tooth decay was an agonizing, universal plague. But for the wealthy, appearing toothless was a social death sentence. It signaled age, poverty, and a lack of breeding. They needed a solution, and the artificial materials of the time, porcelain or hippopotamus ivory, were clunky, ill-fitting, and turned a sickly yellow within weeks. There was only one material that felt right in the mouth, that looked natural under the gaslight, and that could withstand the pressure of a Victorian feast: real human teeth. But where does one find thousands of healthy white teeth in a city where everyone's mouth is a graveyard? The answer lay in the wake of the Great Wars. Imagine the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. 50,000 young, healthy men lay dead in the mud of Belgium. As the sun set on the battlefield and the smoke of the cannons cleared, a different kind of army moved among the fallen. These were the tooth drawers, scavengers who moved through the tall grass not with bandages or water, but with pliers and leather pouches. They moved from corpse to corpse, prying open the mouths of boys who had died far from home and snapping out their front teeth. These were the Waterloo teeth. They were barreled up by the thousands and shipped back to London to the fashionable dental offices of the West End. There they were sorted, cleaned, and mounted onto plates made of gold or ivory. If you were a wealthy Victorian socialite, your beautiful new smile might have been literal fragments of a 19-year-old soldier who died in a bayonet charge. You were wearing the spoils of war inside your own body. Think of the chilling intimacy of that connection. Every time a gentleman laughed at a club or a debutante whispered a secret at a ball, they were doing so through the remains of the dead. It was a macabre recycling of the youth, a way for the elderly elite to buy back the vitality that their own sugary lives had stolen from them. This trade was so lucrative that it didn't stop at Waterloo. For decades, scavengers would follow armies across Europe and even raid the graveyards of the poor, turning the resting places of the forgotten into mines for the dental industry. But the horror of the Victorian mouth didn't end with the source of the teeth. It extended to the chair of the dentist himself. There were no regulations, no licenses, and certainly no anesthesia for the common man. If you had a toothache, you didn't go to a doctor. You went to the blacksmith or the barber. They would sit you in a wooden chair, perhaps wrap a cloth around your head to keep you still, and use a tooth key, a brutal iron instrument designed to hook around the base of the tooth and wrench it out by sheer mechanical force. It was not uncommon for the jawbone to fracture under the pressure, or for the wrong tooth to be pulled in the chaotic struggle of the patient's agony. This was the reality for the majority of London's millions. They lived in a constant state of low-level dental pain, their breath foul with infection, waiting for the day they could afford a set of second-hand teeth or simply lose them all to the pliers. It was a world of masks, where the most beautiful thing about a person was often the most gruesome part of their history. As we reflect on these silent ghosts carried in the mouths of the living, I must ask you to consider your own place in our circle. If these forgotten echoes of the past resonate with you, if you feel the weight of these hidden histories, then I invite you to leave a comment below. Share with us, what part of the Victorian world haunts you the most? Your engagement is the heartbeat of this channel, and it tells the algorithm that these stories deserve to be heard. We have one final descent to make tonight. We have seen the blood, the narcotics, the frantic knives, and the teeth of the fallen. But we have yet to look at the most pervasive and deceptive cure of them all, the practice of bloodletting and the terrifying use of the leech. It was the ultimate betrayal of the body, a practice that claimed more lives than the diseases it sought to treat. Stay with me for this final chapter, for the lanterns are beginning to fade, and the most important lesson of the Victorian night is about to be revealed. The embers are glowing a deep, pulsing red, casting long, skeletal shadows against the library walls. We have walked through theaters of blood and nurseries of silk and stone, but now we must face the most quiet and pervasive horror of all, the slow, systematic draining of life itself. In our modern age, we understand that our blood is our lifeline. a precious river of oxygen and nutrients. We protect it, we cherish it. But to the Victorian physician, blood was often seen as an enemy, a volatile fluid that needed to be tamed, reduced, and conquered. Imagine lying in a mahogany bed, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight to keep out the poisonous night air. You are shivering with a fever, your heart racing as your body fights a desperate battle against infection. You look to the door with hope as the doctor enters, his black bag heavy with the tools of his trade. But he hasn't come to nourish you or give you strength. He has come to take the very thing your body needs to survive. He believes in the ancient theory of the humors, that your illness is caused by plethora, an excess of blood that is boiling over in your veins. He reaches into his kit and pulls out a scarificator, a spring-loaded brass box with a dozen hidden blades. With a sharp click, it snaps against your skin, leaving a grid of bleeding gashes. He watches with a cold, professional satisfaction as your life force spills into a ceramic bowl. If you are too weak for the blades, he brings out his silent assistants, the leeches. He places these dark, slimy parasites on your temples, your chest, or your stomach. You feel their tiny, saw-like teeth sink in as they begin to swell, gorging themselves on your blood until they drop off, heavy and turgid. They were bleeding you to save you, unaware that they were actually stripping you of your only defense, leaving you a hollowed-out ghost in your own bed. This was the ultimate betrayal of the Victorian age, the belief that the path to health was through the depletion of the self. From the smallest child to the aging statesman, thousands were bled until they fainted, their bodies rendered too weak to even groan in pain. It was a practice that claimed more lives than the wars it followed, a ritual of slow-motion execution performed in the name of science. The very hands that were supposed to hold the lantern of progress were instead busy extinguishing the last flickering sparks of life. As we stand here by the dying fire, we must realize that the Victorian era was not just a time of top hats and steam engines. It was a time of profound, agonizing transition. They were a people caught between the superstitions of the past and the cold, hard facts of the future. They were the architects of our world, but they paid for our comfort with their own blood, sweat, and unspeakable suffering. We look back at their cures and their medicines with a shudder of horror. But we must also look at them with a sense of profound gratitude. Every mistake they made, every unwashed hand, every narcotic syrup, and every lightning-fast amputation was a stepping stone toward the world we inhabit today. We live in the light because they endured the darkness. We breathe clean air because they choked on the smog. We survive the operating table because they screamed upon it. Their history is not just a collection of morbid facts. It is the story of our own emergence from the shadows. The fire is nearly out now, and the Victorian night is finally beginning to lift. As the sun rises over the modern horizon, take a moment to appreciate the simple miracle of a sterile bandage, a clean glass of water, and a doctor who knows your name and your worth. The ghosts of 1850 have much to tell us, but their greatest lesson is the value of the life we often take for granted. Thank you for staying by my side through these dark chronicles. Your presence here is the reason these stories are still told. If you felt the weight of history tonight, if you found peace in our journey, I invite you to subscribe and remain part of our circle. The Victorian Nightfall has many more secrets to whisper, and I would be honored to have you here when the next lantern is lit. For now, sleep well, safe in the knowledge that the night is behind you, and the dawn is finally here.